I'm Scott Snyder, Product Marketing Manager at Craig Software. And today I'm speaking with Rodney Dowdall, our lead product architect for Storyboard, our embedded GUI development framework. We will be discussing everything you should know about FPS. Welcome, Rodney. Can you please explain to us what is FPS?
FPS stands for frames per second. And basically what that means is that it's the number of times you can refresh the display the user's looking at over a second. So push new content to the display so that a user can see it.
So what frames per second, or FPS, are development teams usually wanting to hit with their user interface?
Typically, they like to get to 60 frames per second. That's around what the refresh of a display is. It's kind of the golden standard in the UI industry to provide that smooth animation feel and responsiveness within your UI. So yeah, people are trying to hit 60 frames per second.
To the Storyboard engine, is it able to provide 60 frames per second for customers?
Absolutely, it can definitely provide 60 frames per second. One of the challenges we have with the engine, though, is that its architecture is designed to only use the system resources when it's absolutely needed. And this includes the CPU. So if nothing changes in the UI, the engine's not going to draw anything to the screen. Now, this has the effect of reducing the number of frames that you actually have to push to the screen over a second. So I'll explain it with a simple test case here. So let's say you have a button on a screen. And on that button, there's a down state and an up state. So you press it, the down state happens. You release it, the up state happens.
Okay.
So I'm going to press the button, right? It's going to change the background of the button. So that's one frame. And then I'm going to release the button, and it's going to redraw the original image. That's 2 frames. So if you press that button, and that's the only thing you do in a second, you got 2 frames. So the engine will report 2 frames per second, because that's what we were asked to draw. The engine was asked to draw 2 frames over that second. So people will look at that number and go, oh my God, Storyboard engine only does 2 frames per second. It must be horrible. It's the worst engine ever. And it's not. We only drew 2 frames in that second. So we're not going to tell you that we were hitting 60 frames per second, because that's not what you asked us to do. And another common mistake is that you'll set up an animation, and that animation will be, for 500 milliseconds, which is half a second. And they've asked it to run at 60 frames per second. That animation will run for that half a second, 500 milliseconds at 60 frames per second, and then stop. And then nothing else happens in the UI. And so then when we report a frames per second, that's 30 frames per second, because the engine hit 60 frames per second over half of a second. You divide by 2, and that's 30. And the reason we do this, the reason the engine does this, is because if there's nothing needing to be drawn to the screen, then the Storyboard engine is not going to do anything. It's an event-driven engine. So if there's no events happening, if there's nothing that's coming in, there's no data changing on the screen that the end user needs to be made aware of, then the engine will just sit there and wait. And this frees up the CPU for other applications inside the system to go and do the things that they need to do. Or, it conserves power in the low power systems, because you're not running the CPU. You don't need to run the CPU. And this is different than some of the other solutions that provide UI solutions out there, where they're pushing a frame rate. They're updating the screens over time at a specific rate, usually 10 milliseconds or 16 milliseconds. They'll be hammering the display to say, yeah, I need to redraw, I need to redraw. And that's where you get that difference in that FPS reporting between Storyboard engine and maybe some of the other solutions that are out there on the market today.
Yeah, so while it may seem like it's a drawback, and in fact, actually how we do it is a benefit for the customer, because we're not, like you said, tying up unnecessary resources when it's not required.
Yeah, 100%. And that's exactly what our goal was, is because the engine is designed for embedded. And in embedded, you have constrained resources. And when you have constrained resources, you want to be efficient when you're using them. And that's the approach that the engine takes to anything that's within the system.
Perfect. Before we wrap things up for the day, is there any other suggestions that you could provide developers with when it comes to creating a smooth, exceptional experience for their GUI applications that are built using Storyboard?
Yeah, so I think you really want to look at the system that you're running on, and you want to see what capabilities it has, and you want to try and make sure that you're leveraging that system to the best of its abilities, right? So, you know, on a smaller system, on a smaller scale system, maybe you want to cut back on the amount of alpha blending you want to do. You know, take a look at the things that on your system that can be combined so that you don't have to alpha blend. That's an operation that has to happen on the CPU, and you know, that operation can be expensive. So maybe that's one of the things where you want to look at and say, do you need to alpha blend in all these cases, right? Cut down on the number of things that you're updating on the screen. Update only the things that you need. Don't do full screen updates, because, you know, if you have a larger screen, that's more pixels that you have to push to that screen. So, you know, minimize the amount of stuff that you have to push to the screen, and that limits the amount of work that has to be done in order to update the user on what's new on the UI.
Perfect. Makes sense. So thank you very much for your time today, Rodney, and thank you for your time today for tuning in live for this Tech Minute.